Broadcasting live from the School of Athens. This is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olson, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. So today we're going to be discussing civilization and, in particular, Mesopotamia. So to get this party started, I want to remind you that the first civilizations all grew up along river valleys. That would be Egypt along the Nile, Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates, China along the Yellow, and the Indus River Valley civilization along the Indus River. There are all those river valley civilizations. You should, of course, commit to memory where they are because it is essential that you understand and remember that they could not have grown up anywhere else because if there was not fertile soil, and the rivers are, of course, an important facet of life. So we're going to start by offering you the basic characteristics of a civilization. So hopefully this is something that you learned in a prior class, but if not, then here we go. So 5 important characteristics that define a civilization. If you have the following 5 symptoms, you might be a civilization. So you're going to have urban centers or cities. You are going to have specialization of labor. You're going to have complex institutions, which means government. You're going to have record keeping, which means writing. And you're going to have improved technology over time. So these 5 things are what you want to think about when you are discussing and or thinking about early civilizations, especially because it's harder to remember what sets them apart from each other. Okay, so I have a question that you can go ahead and pause me after I ask it. Does using civilization as a defining factor improve relations between humans or deteriorate them? Go ahead and pause me and discuss with either a person around you or think by yourself whether it improves or deteriorates relations between humans. Pause. And whether you want it or not, I'm going to give you my 2 cents. Of course, I think it deteriorates it because what we get is people fitting themselves into a label of civilization, and that is usually at the expense of other people who we view as not civilized. So we'll go ahead and see how this civilization label is applied to Mesopotamia today, but I want you to be careful with how you use it and or be careful with how you see other people using it because it, of course, can be as derogatory as any other label. So we're going to go ahead and get this party started with the Sumerians. And the Sumerians grew up in Mesopotamia, between Potomoy rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. The geography of Mesopotamia is super important because the rivers dictated sort of how the civilization sees itself and evolves. These rivers were very, very wild, they were untamed, they were unpredictable, and that's sort of the civilization that we got, especially when thinking about the afterlife. So as you can see, much of Mesopotamia is in modern-day Iraq, so it's kind of ironic that we are starting this whole journey in AP World History together with a place that is reviled in American culture and society. We are going to begin our discussion with Iraq, a place that the United States has literally blown to smithereens in recent times. So as you can see there, the Fertile Crescent is the area in the green. The Fertile Crescent is, of course, this geographic area that's between the Tigris and Euphrates. It is extremely fertile. You can grow crops there quite easily. The problem is that it floods regularly, or it floods unpredictably and violently, not regularly, which makes it kind of hard to keep those crops growing for a long time. Nevertheless, one of the first city-states that grew up in this Fertile Crescent area was that of Sumer, and that is going to be our topic now. So after the Sumerian civilization sort of gets its start, it develops a government rather quickly, which takes care of the complex institution thing. And Sumeria is split up into city-states, one of which is Ur. You get others along the way, but these city-states have kings. Usually, the military God King is what emerges to be the most powerful because that military king is able to protect his constituents and win battles against other kings that might rival him. So you get this king that eventually also develops into the high priest. So he's not only the military king, but he's the God King as well. And so that sort of allows for some social stability. Okay, so I'm going to show you a short video on Mesopotamia, and when you're watching this video, I want you to think about who had the power in Mesopotamia and what were the issues with the river valley in which it found itself.
Town of Uruk In the thought bubble, Uruk was a walled city with an extensive canal system and several monumental temples called ziggurats. The priests of these temples initially had all the power because they were able to communicate directly with the gods, and that was a useful talent because Mesopotamian gods were moody and frankly pretty mean. Like, according to Gilgamesh, they once got mad at us because we were making too much noise while they were trying to sleep, so they decided to destroy all of humanity with a flood. The Tigris and Euphrates are decent as rivers go, but Mesopotamia is no Indus Valley with its on-schedule flooding and easy irrigation. A lot of slave labor was needed to make the Tigris and Euphrates useful for irrigation. They're also difficult to navigate and flood unpredictably and violently. Violent, unpredictable, and difficult to navigate. Oh, Tigris and Euphrates, how you remind me of my college girlfriend. So I mean, given that the region tends to yo-yo between devastating flood and horrible drought, it follows that one would believe that the gods are kind of random and capricious, and that any priests who might be able to lead rituals that placate those gods would be very useful individuals. But about 1,000 years after the first temples, we find in cities like Uruk a rival structure begins to show up. The palace. The responsibility for the well-being and success of the social order was shifting from gods to people, a power shift that will seesaw throughout human history until probably forever, actually. But in another development we'll see again, these kings, who probably started out as military leaders or really rich landowners, took on a quasi-religious role. How? Often by engaging in sacred marriage, specifically scootily pooping with the high priestess of the city's temple. So the priests were overtaken by kings, who soon declared themselves priests. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So how do we know that these kings were scootily pooping with lady priests?
Okay, so hopefully you were able to pull out that the priests and the military kings were the ones that had all the power in Mesopotamia, but also you were able to identify the issues that the Tigris and Euphrates River had. Keep these in the back of your mind, especially as we discuss ancient Egypt later on. Okay, so the Sumerian religion that was referenced in the video, like we said, was kind of tumultuous and chaotic, especially in its view of the afterlife. It was polytheistic, and it really was super concerned with the flooding of the rivers. Now, oftentimes, they built ziggurats, which here's one pictured behind me, or behind the screen there, and you can see somebody sliding down it. Of course, this is not what they would have been doing back then. Their ziggurats would have looked much more like this, or this, and today they look like this. Pretty accurate, too, with the military personnel there from the United States walking down the stairs. Nevertheless, these ziggurats were, of course, dedications to the gods, which showed one's loyalty to them. These ziggurats would not have been easy to build, and you can imagine that it would have taken quite a lot of slave labor to build them. So you needed slave labor to control the rivers, you needed slave labor to control to build the ziggurats, slaves all over the place. Who had power to control and buy these slaves, you ask? Well, in the Sumerian economy, which had a division of labor, there were of course people that accumulated private property and wealth faster than others. They, of course, had crafts that they created. There were artisans that had specialty items, and because you were along the rivers, trade was relatively easy when the rivers were cooperative. Now you can see this map right here shows that Mesopotamia is sort of centrally located between other important civilizations like that of what will become Greece, the Phoenicians right here on the Mediterranean Sea, Egypt down here, you had the Indus River over here, and so they were centrally located and were able to trade a lot with other people. This of course made the merchants a lot of money, and those merchants, what they were able to do is they became nobles with a lot of power in society, and they also were able to take slaves. So the Sumerian social structure took on a rather recognizable form in that you had a few nobles with a lot of money at the top, and you had, peasants and slaves as you went down the list. So this gets me to a question that I want you to go ahead and pause and think about. Are all people equal? Go ahead and pause me and think about that for a second. Okay, you should have probably come up with the answer that all people should be equal, but they're not equal. See, they weren't equal in ancient Egypt, they weren't equal in the Middle Age Europe, and they're certainly not equal now, as we have this wonderful capitalist system that puts all the workers at the bottom and all the ruling money to lead at the top. Okay, back to Mesopotamia. So, one of the most important things to keep in mind about Mesopotamia is that technological innovation piece that is so important to a civilization, and the record keeping piece that is so important to civilizations. So, Sumeria is credited with having one of the world's first writing systems. It was called cuneiform, and that was basically a system in which you had a bunch of symbols that were carved into rock. That's where the saying set in stone comes from. They also had a number system to accompany their written symbols. These written symbols will be expanded upon in the Phoenicians. We'll talk about that in a second, but that's where we're going to get our first alphabet. It's not necessarily an alphabet yet, it's more symbols. Nevertheless, they had the ability to write, so they had the ability to write stories, the most famous of which was the Epic of Gilgamesh, which we'll refer to in a second. So here are some Sumerian inventions. They invented the wagon wheel, which of course made farming easier. They invented arches, which improved architecture, the potter's wheel, which helped artisans make those oh so important clay pots, sundials to help tell time, 12-month calendar to keep track of different transactions and to keep track of agriculture and whatnot, a metal plow to improve farming. So all of these were inventions that the Sumerians are credited for. Nevertheless, they passed that mark with regard to civilizations. Now, more important was their writing system. We said it before, it was cuneiform. You can see here that the cuneiform evolved over time. It changed based on who was in control of the Sumerian civilization. So by 500 BC, the late Babylonian period has changed the symbol for the sun quite a bit. So these symbols represent complex ideas, and so this is really the beginning of writing. Okay, so the first story, or at least the oldest story in the world according to most, is the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we consider it the oldest story in the world because it was written down. Now, if you're going to have people doing this complex writing on stones, they're probably not going to be able to do that much else. So you need a special kind of person to do this reading and writing, and these people were called scribes. You can't have this in a hunter-gatherer civilization, or you can't have it as easily because scribes were spending so much time writing and reading that they couldn't have spent time making their own food, and therefore you needed the surplus of food that was produced by the Fertile Crescent and the rivers Tigris and Euphrates. So what happened to the Sumerians? Where did they go? Well, most accounts argue that they were invaded, and despite being invaded, they left a lasting legacy. It lasted so far that you guys, many of you at least, have built ziggurats in the 6th grade. Now, who invaded them? Well, there was a city-state nearby called the Babylonians, and they're credited with successfully taking over the Sumerians. They did so because they had a military invention called a composite bow, which was much more effective uh, fighting weapon than just swords and whatnot. And the Babylonians were able to successfully conquer uh, the Sumerian region and turn it into what would be an empire. So here's the Babylonian Empire at its height. You can see that it controlled a little bit of Egypt. It went east of the Tigris and Euphrates and much of what's now the Middle East. There were other important empires at the time. The Assyrians are another well-known fighting force during this time period that caused a lot of havoc, and they of course were one of the most brutal military forces at the time, wreaking extreme havoc on everybody in the area. Okay, the Babylonians are most famous for their god king Hammurabi, who basically brought sort of a manly image to the king. Or to the kingship. So while he thought he was a god, he sort of identified more as a man. And this made the ruler more of a human for most people. Now, him being human allowed him to institute this law code, which was applicable to his subjects. So the law code, which of course is well known for its eye for an eye quote, was incredibly brutal, especially to those who stole, those who made mistakes, and those who cheated other people out of stuff. There are many famously horrible punishments for various things. But a couple of points that I want to make about Hammurabi's Code is that it did sanction slavery and it did protect private property. Laws haven't changed much over the years. Eventually, the Babylonians are going to fall, and then they'll be completely wiped out by the time Alexander the Great's going to take over all this area. We'll talk about him a little bit later. Okay, so another group in the area was the Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians are known for two things. One, they take this cuneiform thing one step further by making an alphabet. So instead of having symbols, you have letters that can be organized into words. They're also known for their ability to sail. And so they are located over here right on the Mediterranean Sea, which leads us to believe that they would be good at using boats. And as you can see by the trade routes there, they were. They had established themselves as a force in the Mediterranean Sea and were especially good at trading stuff. So the Sumerians and the Babylonians would have certainly had contact with the Phoenicians, who would have taken their products elsewhere. Here's just sort of an image that shows you how the Phoenician alphabet is very similar in some ways to the Greek alphabet, which is, of course, one of the main models for the English alphabet. You see how it's changed over time. Okay, so another group that's bumming around in the area were the Hebrews. The Hebrews were descendants of Zoroastrians in the form of religion because they had a belief that was monotheistic. So they believed that Abraham, one of the prophets, talked to God and made this deal with him called the covenant, in which God would give Abraham an area of land called Israel and would bestow upon him all his subjects as long as Abraham promised his allegiance to God. So in return for Abraham's allegiance, God was going to protect Abraham's people. Now, the Hebrews are also well known for being the religion that gives us the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments, of course, are listed right here. Go ahead and pause me if you don't know what they are. They're not terribly important. They sort of serve as the law code for the Hebrew people, similar to Hammurabi's Code to the Babylonians. Here are the Ten Commandments for the Hebrews. The Hebrews are, of course, a religious group, so they're not a political entity. And so these Ten Commandments aren't applied to an empire or a state per se, whereas Hammurabi's Code was applied to the Babylonian Empire. So back to this monotheism thing. It's the idea that there is but one God and only one God. And this one God has made a deal with Abraham to be the God of his people. This is incredibly offensive to anybody who believes in polytheistic religions because it's sort of arrogant by way of religious standards, and it makes a lot of people mad. And so the Jews kind of take on this reputation as being the monotheistic insulters of polytheistic religions. Nevertheless, it's important to note their revolutionary idea, so watch this short video clip and see if you can put it into your mind.
The people who would become the Jews were just one of many tribal peoples eking out an existence in that not very fertile crescent world of Mesopotamia after the agricultural revolution. The Hebrews initially worshipped many gods, making sacrifices to them in order to bring good weather and good fortune, but they eventually developed a religion centered around an idea that would become key to the other great Western religions. This was monotheism, the idea that there is only one true God, or at least that if there are other gods, they're total lameoids. The Hebrews developed a second concept that is key to their religion as well, the idea of the covenant, a deal with God. The main man in this, the big mocker, was Abraham. Not to make this too much of a scripture lesson, but it's kind of hard to understand the Jews without understanding Abraham, or Abram as he was known before he had his big conversation with God recorded in Genesis 17. When Abram was 90 years and 9, the Lord appeared to Abram and said unto him, I am the Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect. And I'm gonna make a covenant with you and a bunch of cool things will happen, like you're gonna have kids and your descendants will number the stars and you can have all the land of Canaan forever. It's gonna be awesome. I'm paraphrasing, by the way, thought bubble. So God promised that Abram would have kids with his wife, even though the dude was already like 99, but there was a catch. This is my covenant which ye shall keep between me and you and thy seed after thee. Every man-child among you shall be circumcised. Keep it PG-13, Thought Bubble. Now that is asking a lot from a guy, especially a 99-year-old geezer like Abram living in a time before general anesthesia. But those were the terms of the deal, and in exchange, God had chosen Abraham and his descendants to be a great nation. From this, we get the expression that the Jews are the chosen people. Thanks for keeping it clean, Thought Bubble. So some important things about this God. One, singularity. He, and I'm using the masculine pronoun because that's what Hebrew prayers use, does not want you to put any gods before him. He is also
Okay, so this covenant and monotheism should now be ingrained in your brain, and you should be able to relate it to the Jews or the Hebrews. Okay, so now, as I said, this made a lot of people mad, and as a result, the Hebrews were divided and dispersed many times throughout history. One of the first times was by a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar, who was upset with the Hebrews' adherence to monotheism and upset with the Hebrews' covenant that he dispersed them from Babylon in a period known as the Babylonian exile, and they won't make it back until the Persians are in power, and a king by the name of Darius brings them back. Okay, so important to note that when the Jews spread out across the world, they do not evangelize. They are not a religion that tries to convert other people. They are a religion that welcomes converts at their own at their own doing, but they're not a converting religion. So whereas Buddhism and Christianity will be monastic religions that sort of try and convert other people, Judaism is not like that. So the Jews sort of just grow by people or by having kids into the religion and by people choosing to convert. In addition to that, they set up their own small communities throughout the world, and they tend to be tight-knit, and they tend to not open up to other people because they don't have a lot of trust based on the fact that they've been divided and dispersed throughout time. So their identity remains, and they have a lot of success most places that they go. But for a long time, they're going to be sort of frowned upon by various powers in various areas. It's important, though, to keep in mind that they have a lot in common with, although also a lot different than Christians that we will see in a couple classes. Okay, so that's Mesopotamia in a nutshell. The thing you'll probably remember most is eye for an eye, but I want to remind you that eye for an eye leaves one-eyed Mr. Potato Heads. Thank you for joining me. This is your Buddha signing off.